Welcome back to another episode. Tonight, we're going to be discussing an aspect of Martin Heidegger's philosophy that isn't always highlighted on YouTube. I haven't found many lectures containing a discussion of his thoughts about society as something fallen and the sense in which it is fallen, and how individuals can hope to redeem themselves within the context of a fallen society, how society itself might redeem itself from its fallen state. If that sounds a little bit theological, it's not entirely inaccurate. It's something that I think structures the way that Heidegger presents a lot of his philosophical thinking. But of course, for anyone who's studied Heidegger for a length of time has come to see, those elements in Heidegger that look like they might be transcendental, that have some kind of transcendent quality to them, have to meet with the fact that he's also the person who tried to dismantle Western metaphysics. So, without going any further into those weeds, let me just say that the topic of discussion for tonight is Heidegger's way of looking at the modern world, modern society. And I'm going to follow that with some remarks about Habermas and how Habermas built upon the way that Heidegger discussed modern society. So I'd like to begin discussing Heidegger from a place that might be somewhat unexpected. I'd like to begin with Karl Marx's ideas about alienation, because I think that in a lot of ways, the fallenness that Heidegger is describing really is a descendant of Marx's notion of alienation. So let's go back to Karl Marx and his idea about alienation. So for Marx, if we begin by thinking of the kind of productive activity that the medieval or Renaissance era craftsman had as a relationship with his work, you can think of it as something that's inherently creative, a kind of labor that allows the craftsman to pour his creativity, his originative creativity, and productivity into something that he's responsible for crafting with his art. And with this kind of work, there's a kind of building up of the human person. There's a potential for expressing one's humanity. There's a potential for genuine creativity. If you contrast that way of being related to one's work with the kind of way of being related to one's work that began in factory settings in the Industrial Revolution, which is the time period that Marx is concerned about, there's a relatedness to one's work that crops up that involves an alienation from the products of one's work. So somebody in a factory where they're just churning out jars of pickles might do nothing all day but just screw a lid on a jar of pickles. And there's no sense in which that laborer, that worker, gets to feel a sense that they're responsible for having created the flavor of the pickles, the quality of the pickles, everything that goes into taking those pickles out through the assembly line. Instead, they're limited to a very specific role. And that's all part of a move toward greater and greater efficiency It's bound up with the development of a technological society. In a pre-technological society, you have simple tools, you have a simple relationship with the material of one's labor, and you're confronted with the need to create and produce according to the rules of an art that you have developed and perfected. But the modern world doesn't allow a building up of the human person anymore when it comes to industrial modes of production. And if we extend that to our present age, there's a lot of careers that involve managing things. There's a lot of careers that involve managing data that are very similar to someone playing a limited role in a series of links in the chain of production that don't involve them very much in a way of being related to the material work, to the material of their work as a creator, as an originator, as someone being involved in originative kinds of production. So this is a Marxist idea about alienation, the alienation that a worker in an industrial society feels relative to the work that they do. And this is a very important concept because going back to Hegel, the way in which you're able to transcend your current state is through your work, it's through your labor. This is a way that you build yourself up. And that kind of labor doesn't need to be limited to labor that you do with your hands. That labor could also cover intellectual labor, artistic labor, and other forms of labor that would involve in the development of the potential of the human person rather than being involved in a kind of work that tends to limit or cut short the growth potential of human beings. So let's now transfer these thoughts into thinking about Heidegger and what he describes as a state of fallenness. He thinks that this state of fallenness belongs to a world that tears people away from their authentic selves and causes them to be involved in an inauthentic mode of life. And this really is something that begins in a way that's similar to Marx with the beginning of the modern era. Except with Heidegger, it begins with Descartes and the development of a subject-object relationship to the world. And perhaps you could think of that moment of splitting up subject and object. Here's me, here I am, I'm the subject, and over there is the object. That's the tree, the bush, the bench, the stream, etc. Those things as objects, as perhaps the initial move toward alienation that creeps in with self and other. Now, another layer to build on top of that, besides the scientific way of being related to objects in the world that enables, is something that Heidegger discusses as techne, which is a Greek word. And Heidegger gives a couple senses of techne. There's a sense in which techne involves the carrying out of a technique, the carrying out of a procedure. There's a way that things are to be done, and you follow that pattern. And in another sense, it involves a more originative kind of production, something closer to the craftsman that I was discussing earlier. And the way that people end up being lost in the fallen world is through the first kind of techne, by being involved in it, by becoming involved in it, because our modern economy that demands efficient modes of production requires that people learn techniques. And that's one layer in which people are, in a sense, alienated from that other mode of techne, which is originative and creative. But the other way in which people can become involved in the world in a way that leads them to inauthentic modes of existence that are not intentional, a mode of existence that involves them being caught up in futurity, is simply being involved with things that Heidegger describes as prattle, or as a kind of mode of existence that you might associate with somebody who just maybe has an addiction to shopping, or, people feel like they need to go to Bed Bath and Beyond on the weekends and look for parking and struggle through all those things. And sometimes that doesn't occur because they're following an authentic mode of existence, but because they're simply lost in what Heidegger calls the they. They're caught up in the world. To illustrate what I mean, I think a poem by William Wordsworth does a very good job. And it makes me tempted to say that Heidegger was truly a romantic at heart. After all, he did write books about Hölderlin, but it almost seems like Heidegger's philosophical approach is really quite similar to the English Romantics, to the American transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau. So here's a few lines from a Wordsworth poem that I think illustrate what he has in mind. So the first few lines of "The world is too much with us," they go, "The world is too much with us, getting and spending, late and soon, we lay waste our powers, little we see in nature that is ours." And that kind of mood, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Now, from the point of view of the people who are struggling to find parking at Bed Bath and Beyond, well, maybe it seems like they are expending their powers. They are expending their powers for something very important. But in the poet's sense of laying waste their powers, is there some truth to that sense? Is there something that we're missing by being involved in the back and forth of modern life? Is there a sense in which, by being involved in the world in that way, we, quote, lay waste our powers? Do we get to a point where we, quote, see little in nature that is ours? We've come to a place where we have a kind of alienation from ourselves and from the world. And what Heidegger thinks is the antidote to this is to come back to Dasein. Dasein is kind of the key to the whole thing. Dasein is simply being there. One has to return to oneself, and one has to return to an authentic mode of existence by orienting oneself toward an originative way of being creative and productive in the world. So one has to return to, or reintroduce into one's life, a way of laboring and working towards something that involves an original creative way of being related to the materials of one's work. So you have to become a craftsman. Now, if the materials of your work are, ideas that you're developing about yourself, if it's self-understanding, that's great. If it's ideas about starting a business, that's great. Heidegger doesn't give any specifics as to exactly how you're supposed to do this. But I think the key here is that you return to a labor, a form of labor that isn't simply always trying to make modifications and adjustments to what amounts to getting caught up in the flow of life. Instead, you come to stop at a place where you can take up a more intentional attitude toward your work. So, with that, I think this is a good point to read a quote from Heidegger. And here is James.
Selfhood is to be discerned existentially only in one's authentic potentiality for being's one's self. That is to say, in the authenticity of Dasein's being as care. In terms of care, the constancy of the self as the supposed persistence of the subjectum gets clarified, but the phenomenon of this authentic potentiality for being also opens our eyes for the constancy of the self in the sense of its having achieved some sort of position. The constancy of the self, in the double sense of steadiness and steadfastness, is the authentic counter possibility to the non-self constancy which is characteristic of irresolute falling. Existentially, self-constancy signifies nothing other than anticipatory resoluteness. The ontological structure of such resoluteness reveals the existentiality of the self's selfhood.
So, I think what Heidegger is talking about here is pretty similar when you just boil it all down to what psychologists and career counselors talk about a lot as finding your life's purpose. When he contrasts constancy with inconstancy and resoluteness toward the future with an irresolute mode of being, what he's really doing there is contrasting intentional modes of existence with modes of existence that are just caught up in the they. And by returning to that originative, creative kind of intentionality toward one's work, one can take up this attitude he calls anticipatory resoluteness. That would be a mode of care that one extends towards the objects around oneself in the world with which one is concerned in a kind of constant, consistent manner that amounts to, and I think you could say it colloquially, that amounts to giving meaning to one's activities in life. Okay. So, with that, I think you can see where Marx and Heidegger meet up. So, we're going to pivot now toward Habermas. And with Habermas, we have a more developed, more fully sketched out picture of exactly what sort of technological society it is that we live in. And the society that Habermas characterizes is one that he terms late capitalist or advanced capitalist societies. And Habermas is very much writing in the tradition of Marx and Heidegger. And he's borrowing also very much from the sociology that was developed in the 1950s and 60s that tried to characterize political power in a particular way. The way in which sociology from the 50s and 60s characterizes political power is in terms of a cybernetic model. So, going back a few lectures, probably about 4 months or so, when I was talking about Habermas, I was talking about the image of a thermostat. A thermostat is there to regulate the temperature of something. I was talking about its role inside of a car. The thermostat opens up and water is able to flow through hoses that go to the radiator that help to cool the hoses and the water that circulates around the engine block. You could think of it more simply in other terms by just thinking about a thermostat in a room that adjusts the temperature either up or down according to a sensor that it has. So the idea there is that power and governmental power in a late or advanced capitalist society comes more and more and more to have a regulatory function. Government is there to respond to crises. Government is there to respond to problems in the economy. Government is there to respond to times when we have social upheaval in some way or fashion or form or whatever. Government is in this regulative position where it's trying to keep the social cohesion of a society going. It's trying to maintain a certain social equilibrium. And the way that it's structured is that at the very top, you have those who are in power. Those who are in power have certain goals. They might have the continuation of their own political power as one of those goals. Quite often, in an advanced capitalist society, greater economic growth is one of those goals. And in order to achieve those goals, there needs to be a certain level of social integration, a certain level of social cohesiveness that allows those goals to be met. And what power is trying to avoid is a state of affairs where society breaks down because of a perceived failure on the part of the government, leading to a sense of delegitimation. So let's say we have a president and the economy falls apart. Because the economy is thought of as being the responsibility of the president, right or wrong, if the economy falls apart on his or her watch, that will probably lead to their not being elected the next cycle. So that's the sense in which they lose their legitimacy. Now, this cybernetic model can also extend to the way in which, in a society like ours, data and information and statistics can be used to influence people and perhaps can even extend to controlling their behavior to a certain extent. As the economy is pushing toward more and more efficient modes of production, we need more and more data to help us understand how we can arrive at greater and greater efficiency. So, in the case of advertising, why would you want to advertise a product to people who are very unlikely to purchase your product? Why not find a target group that you know might be more likely to buy it? If you are somebody who is producing a backpack for ferrets, let's say, why not advertise the ferret backpack to a group of ferret lovers on Facebook? As opposed to just scattering your advertising seeds to the wind and seeing where they fall. And in the case of government, you can target your message towards certain groups using data about what those groups' interests are, where they're located geographically, what kind of groups they're in on Facebook, and the things that they talk about in social media. You can craft your message to those people to try to get the biggest outcome for the efforts that you're putting out there to get their votes. But there are societies in the world where data and information can be used to watch over people and control people. And some people feel that our society might be in danger of becoming one of those kinds of societies, and perhaps already is without our actually knowing it. In some societies, there's a threat involved, a real physical threat involved with speaking out against the government. And the more data, the more information that people have, the more that kind of threat toward anybody saying anything that might lead to them being taken off to prison or assassinated or whatever becomes more of a concern. Becomes more of a concern because somebody is watching you, and by watching you, they have a means of controlling you. And all this really makes me think of Foucault's image of the panopticon that we discussed a few episodes back. I believe it's in the episode on truth and power. But it's a means of control that amounts to surveillance. I think that model is embedded in the cybernetic model that Habermas discusses, although he doesn't make much or any use of the panopticon image that I know of. But the two certainly do go hand in hand. So you take that model, you take that cybernetic model that describes what political power really is in an advanced or late capitalist society, and you situate it in a technological society, a society that is involved in science and technology as a way of advancing its interests. And suddenly you can see how all of these parts fit together. So, with the development of technology, you have the development of greater means of control. At the same time, that feeling that government might pose a threat to you, that somebody is watching you, that people are collecting data about you, the feeling of loss of privacy and perhaps anxiety about where that might potentially lead is offset by the fact that a lot of people are living more comfortable lives by becoming people who manage data, are involved in data. And it's probably going to become increasingly the case that in careers of the future, people will become data managers. So, with that, I think we're in a good place to read a quote from Habermas's book. This is an essay titled Technology and Science as Ideology. And the quote is from Herbert Marcuse.
The principles of modern science were a priori structured in such a way that they could serve as conceptual instruments for a universe of self-propelling, productive control. Theoretical operationalism came to correspond to practical operationalism. The scientific method which led to the ever more effective domination of nature thus came to provide the pure concepts as well as the instrumentalities for the ever more effective domination of man by man through the domination of nature. Today, domination perpetuates and extends itself not only through technology, but as technology, and the latter provides the great legitimation of the expanding political power which absorbs all spheres of culture. In this universe, technology also provides the great rationalization of the unfreedom of man and demonstrates the technical impossibility of being autonomous. of determining one's own life. For this unfreedom appears neither as irrational nor as political, but rather as submission to the technical apparatus which enlarges the comforts of life and increases the productivity of labor. Technological rationality thus protects rather than cancels the legitimacy of domination, and the instrumentalist horizon of reason opens on a rationally totalitarian society.
Okay, so the last remarks I'm going to make are just going to be on what Habermas takes to be the antidote to this sickness in our technological society, the way out. So we've already discussed Heidegger's way out, which is returning to an authentic mode of existence, returning to Dasein, and originative, creative, productive labor. And what Habermas says is the antidote, the way out, is a form of communication that dissolves an alienated way of being related to other people. I think you could characterize it that way. So, one of its outstanding characteristics is that both partners in the communicative situation are open to what the other one has to say, and neither is trying to dominate the other. So, if our way of being related to nature is one of domination, trying to make use of things for our own purposes, we shouldn't treat people that way. In a sense, Habermas is reminiscent of Kant here. We should not treat people as useful for something, but as simply good for their own sake, as ends in themselves, rather than as something that can be made use of for something. That latter way of approaching the world, approaching other people who we are in communication with, is one that comes from an instrumental way, an instrumental, rational way of being involved in the world. And by entering into communicative processes and situations with other people that do not involve that kind of instrumentality, that way of taking things in the world to be instruments for our use, we can begin to form a society that is founded on something other than instrumental rationality. So, with that, I'll say good night.